In this video, I'll be discussing volumetric effects in 3D Studio Max. I'll be using 3ds Max Design 2010 for this video. There are several volumetric effects in 3D Studio Max. Probably the most commonly used would be a volumetric lighting effect. Therefore, since that's the most popular, that's probably a good starting point. So what I'll do is I've got a scene here that's set up for the scanline renderer in 3ds Max, and I have this object, just a spline object that I've created, the 3ds Max logo, and then I have a light source. This is a targeted photometric light. And if I render the scene now the way it is, you can see that you can see the light source, and the object here. But what we're going to do is just add a volumetric effect to this to give some light volume to this light so that it passes through, and you'll be able to see this object a lot better. Now there are a couple of ways to approach that. One way would be go to the in the rendering rollout here, the effects tab. Actually, this is an effect. This is an atmospheric. So you'll go to the environment. You have to switch over to the environment option, and we're looking at the atmospheric effects here. You could add a volumetric light effect, and then you could come down and tell it to pick a light source and go and just select your light source, and it assigns that volumetric effect. I'll go back and delete this. Otherwise, another way you could do that is just to scroll down in the light settings here, and if you keep scrolling, you'll see a rollout for atmospheric and effects, and you can just click add and select volume light. And if you go select this object and then go to the setup button, you'll see you're right back at the environment tab, and basically the same thing, the same process that we went through a while ago, except it was from within this light setting. So now that I've added this effect, if I just go ahead and render the scene the way it is now, you can see that we now have a little bit of a volume light effect visible here. And of course there are some settings here that you can use to adjust this. The first one I'll talk about is the density. If I increase this, then that's naturally going to increase the density of this volumetric effect. Now the first thing that you notice here is that I'm not getting any shadows coming through here. You would expect if this was a volume light, a true volumetric effect, that there would be some shadows. The reason for that is that on the light settings here, the light is defaulted to ray trace shadows. And speaking of the scanline renderer, if you're using that, then in order to get those volumetric shadows, you need to switch over to shadow maps. So I'll just enable the shadow map option here and give that a render. And now you can see we're getting shadows generated from this object. Another point to keep in mind before I get too far into this, in the common tabs rollout of the render settings, you need to make sure that this, if you're not seeing any of this, you need to make sure the atmospheric option is enabled. If it's not, you won't have any atmospheric effects in the render. Okay, so that looks pretty rough the way it is. One thing that does take into consideration here in the calculations is the parameters of the shadow map options. If I increase this to, let's say, 2048, you'll notice I have more detail in here, but it still looks rough. But we'll be able to smooth all of this out with the volumetric settings. So I'm just going to leave that at 2048 so that I get as much detail as I can in here from the shadow maps themselves. And then I'll just scroll back down, select the volume light, and go back into the settings here. So if you notice, as far as the quality of this, right now we're looking using the filter shadows. It's using the use light sample range. Now here in our settings for the volumetric light, here in the shadow map settings, you'll see the sample range. If I increase this and give that a render, you can already tell that it's slowing down, but you see that we're getting a nice smooth effect now. So that's how you could smooth out that effect. There's also presets that you could use. If I set this to low, you can see that looks just wonderful, doesn't it? I don't know why you'd use the low. I guess for preview renders. you could set it to high, and again you can see the percentage that's going to here, which is a little bit higher than what I had a while ago, so you know it's going to give you a decent result here. And if you want, that's in the auto mode. You could go ahead and turn off auto and then specify a percentage, but normally this high preset works fairly well. So if you want to manually use a setting here on your light, you could use that, or if you wanted to use these presets or just automatic manually put in a percentage here to smooth that volumetric effect out, that's where you would do that. I'm just going to leave it on the high setting for now. Okay, the next setting that I'll look at is this fog color. As you would expect, that is of course the color of the fog. So if I change this to something like that, you'll get this red fog. This max light percent kind of limits the amount of glow that you'll have here. If you decrease this, and I'll just pull that down to something like, that's good. That's going to limit that brightness that we saw here. So you probably want to keep that on the high side. The minimum light percentage is sort of like an ambient light effect. If I increase that, then the areas that aren't in the volumetric effect will also be illuminated, so it kind of washes out the effect. You can see just a small amount has a large impact on the scene. Next we have this exponential option. When this is disabled, the density of the volume effect increases linearly with distance. When you enable this option, the density increases exponentially with distance. In the help file, under this description, it's recommended that you only activate this checkbox when you want to render transparent objects within that volumetric fog. So you can kind of think of this as a sort of a decay, a different calculation of the decay effect. If I render this as it is, we'll compare the two renders. It'll be a very subtle effect. I'll just, with it off, I'll put this in the RAM player. And then I'll enable that and give another render. Put this back in the other channel of the RAM player. And you can kind of see that it's just a subtle effect on the fall off calculation of this. One is more linear, the other is exponential. The next setting would be this attenuation color, and use the attenuation color. This is going to attenuate the light to this color over distance. So you think of it kind of like the attenuation controls on some of the standard lights. It's going to mix to this color over distance. So let me just enable this, and it's going to be hard probably for us to see this with using a photometric light, but I'm just going to leave that the way it is. But I say that because with the standard lights you have the attenuation controls, and with a photometric light you have it has a built-in decay, inverse square decay on those photometric lights. So there's not really an attenuation control on photometric lights, so we'll just control it from here. So I'll give this a render, and it's probably going to kill the effect quite a bit. So what I need to do is I have an attenuation multiplier, and it's also controlled by this attenuation settings here. The attenuation setting, the start percentage, this defines where the attenuation actually starts, and it's relative to the light's attenuation parameter. And as I mentioned, this photometric light doesn't have an attenuation parameter. It uses a decay function instead. So if I was to reduce that percentage, it's going to start that attenuation closer to the light source. So I'm just going to leave it at 100 for this particular photometric light. The end percentage is similar to the start range, except of course it's the ending of this attenuation color. And again, it would be based on the attenuation controls like on a standard light, but for a photometric light it's just based off of that decay, that built-in inverse square decay. Lower values than 100% will actually extend out the glow farther, whereas higher values you can sort of customize where it's going to decay or where it's going to convert to this color, this attenuation color. So in order to see what's going on here, let me first go in and increase the attenuation multiplier. And I'll just bump that up to 250 to begin with here. And now you can see that blue color. Now if I wanted more of the original effect, this actual fog color, what I could do is actually increase the in percentage. So let's just bump that up to something like 5,000 and see what that looks like. And you can see this is starting to get increase here in the center. Let's try 50,000. And again, I have to use some weird numbers in here because I'm using the photometric light. But one thing to also note here is that you can see how the color is actually blending. It's gradiating from this color to this color, so you actually get the purple effect from the red to the blue. So it's probably, whereas if I enable this wind strength, I can tell it which direction to actually move that noise effect in. So that's the basics of the volume light option here in 3ds Max. Now what I'll do is switch over to Mental Ray because Mental Ray has a couple of other volumetric effects that we can talk about, and there's still a couple of volumetric options here to discuss. But for some reason there's the misconception that this 3ds Max volumetric effect, the ones that work with the scanline renderer, that they don't work with Mental Ray, and that's just not true. So what I'll do is just set this up for Mental Ray. The first thing that I need to do in order to get this to work is I have to switch from shadow maps, which is the scanline shadow map, over to the Mental Ray shadow map, and then I just switch renderers to Mental Ray. And what I want to do is go in and turn off indirect illumination because I don't need any indirect illumination here. That defaults to on, enabled in 2009 and 2010. And with just those changes, if I just go in at render, you can see that it's rendering just fine. So these atmospheric effects in Max, they work fine with Mental Ray. I think there's just a confusion there because some of the aftermarket plugins aren't compatible with Mental Ray, but the ones that are built into 3ds Max, they are compatible. And in fact, the volumetric effects here, they work quite well with Mental Ray. If I just open up one of the scenes that I've already prepared here for Mental Ray, I'll just open this one. So here we have basically the same scene. I have the light source set up to use Mental Ray shadow maps, and in the Mental Ray shadow maps options, I'm going to pick up the transparent shadows and color from materials or whatever is in this volumetric area. In this case, for the 3ds Max logo, I've prepared a glass object, an Arc and Design material, and this glass object is a strong orange color using this refraction color at distance value. So if I look at the volumetric settings here, the volumetric light will be white, and you can see the values here, but the main thing is to know is that the volumetric light is white. So if I just give this a render, what it's going to do is produce this white volumetric effect, but it's going to pick up that orange color from this glass object as well, as you can see it's doing here. What I'll do is just go ahead and pause the video while this is rendering. And so here you can see how it's picking up that volumetric effect, picks up that color from this material itself and then transfers it through the fog. So again, just to reiterate, this volume light effect, the default effect that comes with 3ds Max, this is the one that works with scanline. It is compatible with Mental Ray. As you can see, it works fine with Mental Ray. Now, Mental Ray also has several other volumetric effects specific to Mental Ray. And if I load up one of the other scenes here, one of them uses a party volume shader, also known as a participating volume shader. So in Mental Ray, if you go to the renderer tabs and scroll down in the camera effects section here, or for example, if I wanted to limit it to from the top of this object down, I could set a height. I would measure that say it's 16 inches high, then I could put in for a height of 16 inches, and everywhere under that would have that volumetric effect, but once it reaches that, it would cut off. So what I'll do is just go ahead and give this a render with the settings that I have here. Before I do, let me just describe the step options here. The minimum and the maximum step are what you would control the amount of noise or grain in this volumetric effect. The default value I think is 1 in 5 or 0.1 in 5, something like that. And so the higher numbers that you use, the faster it's going to render, but the less detail you'll have. So for this particular scene, I'm using 0.1 and 1 for these length values. Now, one of the tricks to get this to work is that you have to have geometry behind this volumetric effect. And what I'll do is I'll hide this object. And if I render this, you're not going to see any of the volumetric effect out here outside of this object. You can see it going through this glass, but you don't see it anywhere else. And so the reason for that is there's no geometry back here for that to be seen by. So I'll just undo that hide option, and this is just a single-sided plane that I've put in that's parallel to my camera here so that I can kind of see this effect. And it doesn't matter what material you apply to this. I've just put a standard material on that plane. But what I'll do is just pause the video while this renders. So as this is rendering, you can see that the party volume shader really gives you a realistic result. It tends to look a little bit better than the 3ds Max default atmospheric effect that you can assign to these lights. I think so anyway, because it does give you a nice gradiated fall off. This just looks really soft, the effects that it can give, so it's quite nice to use. If you're using Mental Ray, be sure and check out that party volume shader. Again, it's in the render tab under this volume effect, and you'll just drag it to your material editor to make the changes that you need to in the settings here. Now, before I leave this particular topic, you may be wondering how I come up with these values for the R, G1, and G2. The answer to that is actually in the documentation, the Mental Ray documentation that comes with 3ds Max. And I just went to get to that, I went to Help and Additional Help, and then you can click on this Mental Ray reference. And what I did was I knew what I was kind of searching for. If you don't know what you're searching for, it's kind of hard because this isn't the most user-friendly documentation around. I just did a search for MIE, and you get this list of the participating media, which is the party volume shader. And if you read through here, it tells you what these values are. There's different function for I use this Rayleigh, which is R.5, which you can see I have set here. Gotta love it when the documentation in 2009 and 2010 it kind of hides itself behind 3ds Max here if you click on, especially with the material editor open. So what I have to do is switch over and bring that back to the front. But this Rayleigh function here is best for creating things like cigarette smoke and dust, as it says here, for particles that are slightly larger, slightly smaller than the wavelength of light. So that's why I used Rayleigh here, because I wanted kind of a smoky, dusty look rather than some of these other settings. But there's really not much difference if I was to change that and render it. It wouldn't be much of a change. It'd be a very subtle change. So in case you were wondering where I come up with those values, that's where I've got that information from. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to come up with this information. The only reason that I plugged those numbers in there was because I found it in that documentation. So anything outside of those three options, I'm not sure. You could just play around with the values and see what they do. But as far as a scientific setting, I'm not sure how they would measure that as just being an end user. It would just be more so a setting that I like to view outside of those three that we have the measurements for. So that's the party volume shader. I want to look at a couple of these other volume shaders. For example, there's a beam shader, mist shader. So let's look at this beam shader first, because it doesn't do what you're probably thinking that it's going to do. I'm just going to drag this over to the material editor as an instance. And what you're thinking is it's going to create a beam of light by the name beam. Well, that's not what it does. If I give this a render, you can kind of see this haze that it puts around the light source here. What I need to do is make this brighter. So I'm just going to change the color, something like so, and the density I'll increase that to 50 and render again. And you can see it's creating this area around the light source, which it looks kind of strange in this particular shot here, because the object that I put here in the scene for the party volume shader to work, I need to get rid of it now. I'll just hide this object because it's interfering with this beam shader. So I'll render this again. You can see that it looks a little different this time. So let me just decrease that strength. Let's try 10. And let me pan this camera around so that we can get a better view of this. Actually, I'll just go to a perspective view and just rotate. Like so. You can see it creates kind of just a glow, a haze around a light source. It's not projecting a beam out, it's just kind of a glow effect around the light source. Let me just decrease this a little bit further. I think it'll be a little more evident. You can see that glow decreasing. But it does produce like kind of a volumetric look here. The problem with this is that it doesn't generate shadows. It doesn't cast shadows. So you can tell that we're not getting those volumetric shadows. This is more so just kind of a glow effect around the light sources. If you wanted kind of a haze around a light source, this would be good to use because it's quick to render. And it's quick to render because it doesn't have to calculate any of the volumetric shadows or things like that. So if you wanted just around your light sources, just this kind of a soft glow, you could dial that in like so. Just decrease that, use it like a low density, and you'll get this nice soft lighting around your light sources. But if you're looking for that, for it to cast shadows or something, it's not going to do that. Okay, so here I've opened up another scene just to take a closer look at this beam shader and some of the other volumetric effects that probably better seen in a different scene than what I had a while ago. What I've done is, let me just open up my material editor, and I've got mental ray here. I'm going to select, enable this volume effect, and drag this beam shader over. Now I've got the lights assigned here. You don't have to do that. Because these are the only lights in the scene. If you wanted to limit which lights had that glow effect around it, you could do so by adding specific lights here. Since I want all of the lights in this scene, I'm just going to disable that, and it'll be applied to every light in the scene. And I should probably disable that and render it, but I'll just leave it as is and just let this go. And I'll pause the video while this renders. And so what you're seeing here is that haze effect is created by that beam loom shader. So if I put this in the RAM player, we'll know that's width, and then come in here and disable that effect and render the scene again. So as you can see, it's quite a big difference between the two, with and without. That beam shader does give a nice fog effect around here, but again, as I said, it does not produce the volumetric shadows that you may want. But if you're just trying to produce a foggy effect, it may work well for that. Alright, let me just close these. And what we'll look at is the maybe this mist shader. So I'll just replace that and drag this over. And of course enable the option here, otherwise it won't render. Okay, now if I render this using the mist shader, you'll see that it just provides kind of a general fog to the entire scene. It's not really based on a light source, it's just more so of a general fog. And it looks blue in this particular scene because of my exposure settings. I'm using a fairly low Kelvin value. If I increase that to 6500 and render this, it should come out white, kind of a grayish color. So just in case you were wondering where that bluish tint was coming from, you can, and here in the mist loom shaders, you can specify the color of this. For example, if I wanted it to be green, I could tell it, just specify a green color there. And you can see now I have kind of a nuclear glow to the scene. If I wanted less of effect, I would increase the transparency. It's a 0 to 1 option here. So I increase the transparency. I've reset this back to the original color. And you can see it kind of pretty much kills off that effect. Let me cancel this. Now if I set this likewise down to 0, it'll make a very strong effect. It's not solid, but it's close to it. So it works fairly well for a misty type scene where you have a strong fog. You can control that and add that in fairly well using this mist loom shader. Some of the options here are kind of hit and miss as far as working as you would expect. Again, these loom shaders are kind of old, and I think they're more geared towards Maya, and we're just kind of ported over for us to use in 3ds Max. But some of these options, such as using this map to control the fog and things like that, that doesn't really quite work as expected. I think you need to add in some UVW generators and things like that in here. I've never had really much luck with it, so I'm just going to kind of skip over that. There are a couple of different ways of using fall off. Right now it's set for a realistic fall off as far as the density. If I can control that here by, if I increase this and give this a render, I'm basically taking control of the fall off of this. As you can see now it's pretty much solid. So let me cancel that. And if I just put this back down to, let's say 0.15, you can see that the fall off is a little bit less here, or I can see a little farther into the scene. So you have several different modes here. You have a linear fall off where you say a start point and an end point. Right now it defaults to this realistic fall off, which works probably the best of all three of these. You have a custom fall off where you can specify a start, a middle, and an end. But basically this is kind of similar. This camera shader, this mist camera shader, is kind of similar to the fog effect that 3ds Max has already. You just have more control, more options here. So let me go in and actually delete this. And what I'll do is, let's look at the fog effect and the 3ds Max fog effect. So I'm just going to pull up my environment tab here, and under atmospherics, similar to where we added the volumetric fog or the volume light, I'm going to add you have a volume fog or you have a fog effect. I'll just add the fog effect first. Okay, and just scroll down to the settings here and just give this a render with the default settings, and you can see it's fairly bright. But it's, if you notice, we have similar controls to that loom shader we were looking at a while ago, the mist loom shader. You have an exponential fall off. You can define an environment color map, an environment opacity map. If I wanted to set this, let's say a darker gray, still a little bit strong. Let me cancel this. You can have it whether it fogs the background or doesn't. So if I disable that, what it's going to do is you'll only see the fog on the objects. The background will not have any fog. So if I wanted the environment or the color to vary the color of this fog, I could specify a map here. For example, if I put in let's use a checker map. Drag this over to the material editor as an instance copy. I'm just going to leave, you have to set it up for environment mapping since this is kind of an environment effect. I'm just going to put it on screen for now. And let's just say 5 and 5, and I'm going to change the colors here. Something really disgusting. Like so. And I want this to fog the background just so that we can see the effect that that color has. So you can see this is picking up the color from that map. So you could use something like a fall off map to get some control over this. This is kind of a silly example, I know, but it shows what it's doing. So if you wanted to plug in like a fall off map or a gradient ramp and have it blend, kind of dial out the horizon and things like that, that would be useful. Let me just copy or cut this, and if I paste this down in the for the environment opacity, I need to change this to a black and white map for that. Just make sure that's there, and I'm going to just a particular atmospheric effect. You have to use a gizmo, and so what that is this gizmo is basically a container for this effect. So to get to the gizmos, you'll scroll down here to the helpers option here and expand out the rollout here, and you can see there's several options, and we're looking for atmospheric apparatus. Click on that, and here you have the different gizmos. You have a box gizmo, a cylinder gizmo, and a sphere gizmo. So what I'll do is just select box gizmo, and let me switch to a different viewport here, and I can just draw out this gizmo where I want that effect to happen. So I just want it to be along the road here, and I'm just going to put it back like so and drag up the height, something like that. And now what I can do is that I've created that gizmo, I can come in here and click pick gizmo and then select it, and it'll be added here. So now this particular volume fog effect will only occur within that box, that gizmo. So I'll just move this out of the way. If I pull up the render on this and give this a render, what you'll see is that the volumetric fog is contained within that apparatus, kind of gives us this fog of death, if you will, that's contained within that box. Let me just pause the render while this calculates. So by default, these are the default settings here. You have this soften edges. What that's doing is pulling that away, that strong effect, softening it up as it gets towards the edge of the apparatus at gizmo. Higher value, of course, would bring that in even further and make it softer. You have the color here. Obviously, no need for me to change that. You know that's going to change the color of the volume. Density, if I decrease that, you're controlling how thick that fog is. This stepping size is similar to the party volume in that it controls the smoothness of the transition between the fog and the non-fog areas. So what I'll do, I'll just come in and decrease the density here, something like 5. And noise is already activated. I just need to change the size here a little bit. It's a little too large. I'll decrease that, maybe change it to fractal and render that. Let me just cancel this render because you can see that at a density setting of 5, that's still a little bit strong. So what I'll do is just decrease that to 0.5. And by the way, the range on this, let's make that 0.5. It's interesting because in the help file or in the documentation for this, it says that the range, the density here is capped at 20, 0 to 20, but obviously you can see you can go higher than that. So 20 pretty much blows everything out, makes a solid object, so why you'd want to go beyond that, I'm not sure that you would. So I'm going to set that to 0.5. Okay, so there you can see that's quite useful to use because you can control where that happens. You can move that gizmo around if need be to kind of animate this in a way. You still have the controls here similar to the volume light, and that you can animate, give kind of a blowing effect to this if I wanted to, change the phase, just have this move around and give some life to it. And what I'll do next is go in, and actually I'm going to leave that gizmo in and delete this effect, this atmospheric effect, because I'm going to look at the next one, this fire effect. And I wanted to leave that gizmo there because I know that the fire effect also uses the gizmo. So let me just pick the same one. And again, you can change the size of that gizmo to whatever that you needed. And in fact, let me delete that. What I'll do is use a sphere gizmo for this. Just move that up like so. And of course add it into the fire effect. And if I give this a render, we now have this fire effect, which the level of realism here is not very high, as you can tell. The neat thing here is that that's reflected. I'm not sure if you can see this, probably so. It's reflected in these ray trace spheres here. But you have various settings here on the fire effect. Right now it's set up as a fireball. If I wanted more a tendril effect, which would be more, think of campfire flames and things like that, you could set it to tendril. Let me just render this, which in this case it looks pretty much the same because I need to come in and change some of the other settings here. For example, that flame size is rather large, so that's why you didn't really see much of a change there. If I come in and lower that down to 1, so there you can see how we're starting to get some more detail in here. To create kind of a fire effect, it's still, even though it still looks like a fireball right now, that's because I'm using that spherical apparatus. You probably want to use something like change this to hemispherical. And let me just move this down and let's say over to the side a little bit just so I can see it. Maybe move this guy over and render that. So by increasing the flame size here, I had it set too small earlier. You can actually see the tendrils now. So I may want to increase that a little bit further. You could add more detail to the flame details here. 10's the highest amount that you can go to. And as you add more detail, you may want to increase the samples here. I'm going to set that for 8 and let's say 24. You could also change the colors if you wanted. I'm going to leave those as they are. Render that again. And so with that, you can create kind of a fire effect. I'm not sure how much usage this actually gets anymore, since there's plugins out there that do fire so well, such as Fume and Afterburn and things like that. This probably doesn't get much usage anymore, but I'll occasionally hear people either see them on the forums that use this still, or hear them get questions about something that happens with this. And one of the main questions that I get is that it renders black. And let me just set up a scene here right quick that where I can show you what happens and why that happens. The main issue is that they're using a daylight system with, say, the mental ray, sun, and sky. And I'm just going to come in and turn these lights off because I don't want to wait for the render times on that. And so they add the daylight system, and then once they render the scene, what will happen is that fog, or the fire effect that used to be white or yellow and red, is now black. And the reason for that is that the exposure control is set up for a daylight system. This, even though you would think fire is bright, the way that this is set up is that this doesn't have the intensity, the same intensity as the daylight system here. So if you wanted to see this fire in the daylight, what you'd have to do is configure the daylight, the photographic exposure control accordingly so that you could see this. To do that, what you do is switch this to the physical scale to unitless and give this a value of something like 95,000. And what that's not going to change anything with the lights here. What that's going to change is that it will give this effect an intensity value that can be seen with this particular exposure setting. So now if I render this again, you can see that the fire effect shows up as you would expect. I'm not sure if you'd actually see it that brightly in the daylight. Probably so. You may actually want to increase that a little bit further to make this brighter if you wanted to do so. But that's the reason why, if you're rendering this either the fire effect or the fog effect, and it's turning out black, and you're using the daylight system with a daylight exposure control, that's the reason why. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the discussion on this, the volumetric effects in 3ds Max. As you can see, there's several volumetric effects, and the ones that ship with 3ds Max that are scanline effects, they do still work with mental ray. So you can keep those in your arsenal. But for volumetric light effects, be sure to check out that party volume shader because it does produce some really nice results.